Curved hems look awesome but can be tricky to sew. So I'm going to go ahead and show you 3 different ways you can finish your curved edge and make them perfect. The first method we'll do is a rolled hem. So I'm going to start by adding a basting line 3/8 of an inch in from my edge here. Now that I have this basting line, I could go ahead and press along this edge, but my curve here is a bit too severe to do this successfully. So I'm going to go ahead and run a second line here in between the first line and the edge of my curve, which is going to allow me to gather it so that the curve will fold in more easily. So now that I have that second basting line, I'm going to go ahead and pull on my bobbin thread from that line and get it to gather up a bit. As I'm working, I'm evening out the gathers so that the ripples are subtle and the excess fabric is evenly distributed along the curve. As you can see, by gathering that line, my curved edge is starting to curl in, so now I can go ahead and iron it flat. Okay, so now I want to turn this one more time. So I'm going to go ahead and add a final basting line here about 3/8 in from this new edge. Okay, so I have that line stitched, and now I need to gather in my curved edge again so that it will fold in cleanly. So I'm going to go ahead and gather that outside line, pulling on the bobbin thread from my first basting line, which is now on my fold. So now I can go ahead and iron it flat. So now that my hem is all pressed, I'm ready to sew. I'm going to go ahead and run a stitch here right along this edge. So now I have my hem complete, and I'm going to go ahead and remove those basting stitches. And that's all there is to it. Now I have my finished rolled curved hem. So the second method we'll do is a bias facing. Here I have a 1-inch bias tape that I made out of my fabric, and I've gone ahead and pressed up one edge about 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to go ahead and line up the unfolded edge of my bias with the curved edge and pin it into place. As you're pinning, you'll want to stretch your bias out a bit so that the inner curve of the bias is laying flat. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew right along here about 1/4 of an inch in. Okay, so now everything is sewn, so I'm just going to trim a little bit away from this edge. And then go ahead and press this seam open. Next, I'm going to flip this over to the other side and then press the bias over one more time. So at this point, I'm ready to stitch the bias down, and there's a few different ways I could do this. I could stitch it by hand for a clean finish with no visible stitching, or I could top stitch it on my machine. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this one on the machine so you can see how that looks. So here I have my finished bias facing curved hem. You can see this looks pretty similar to the rolled hem, but you could always mix it up and make your bias in a contrast fabric for a fun finishing detail. The final method is the bias binding hem. Here I have a double folded bias tape that I've made out of my fabric. To start, I'm going to start on the right side of my fabric and unfold one side of my bias tape and pin it to the curved edge. So now that my pins are in, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew right here along this fold line from my bias tape. Okay, so that first part is sewn, and we're going to fold the bias tape around the edge of the fabric, ending up on the wrong side. Once folded, that bias tape should meet or cover that first stitch line. So at this point, I'm ready to stitch the bias tape down, and again, I have options for how to finish this. I could hand stitch it for that invisible look, or top stitch through all the layers, but for this, I'm going to stitch in the ditch, which will give me a barely visible stitch line on the front of my piece using my machine. So to do this, I'm going to stitch right here in the edge of that first seam on the right side of my fabric. And I'm going to want to make sure that I'm catching that bias tape on the back side of my fabric as I sew. So now my hem is complete, and you can see my stitches here because I'm using a contrast thread, but if you're using matching thread, this stitch would be nearly invisible. And now you have 3 ways that you can finish your curved hem.